Greetings. In what follows, I'm going to provide a series of short lectures, short talks on Waiting for the Barbarians, and I'm going to try to post this on YouTube. I know some of you guys have been having trouble getting to the integrity workshops. So let's start at the opening of the novel with this very sort of strange paragraph that begins it. And as my colleagues in creative writing say, the openings of novels, the openings of short stories often usually contain the kernels of everything that comes later, and I think it's a kind of, I think that there's something true in this opening. So if you turn to page 1 of Waiting for the Barbarians, here we go. I have never seen anything like it. 2 little discs of glass suspended in front of his eyes in loops of wire. Is he blind? I could understand it if he wanted to hide his blind eyes, but he is not blind. The discs are dark. They look opaque from the outside, but he can see through them. He tells me they are a new invention. They protect one's eyes against the glare of the sun, he says. You would find them useful out here in the desert. They save one from squinting all the time. One has fewer headaches. Look, he touches the corners of his eyes lightly. No wrinkles. He replaces the glasses. It is true. He has the skin of a younger man. At home, everyone wears them. So what we have in the beginning is a conversation between an unknown I and an unknown he, and it turns out that the two are both members of the colonial administration. The I is obviously the magistrate, who I've described in my integrity lecture as a kind of traditional intellectual, and that is someone who, just by the role they play within the system, even if they have problems with the system, reinforces the power of the system and sustains the system, sustains the status quo. And the other figure, the he, in this passage is obviously Colonel Joel, that we learn later that he's a torturer and etc. And really starts to foul up the status quo of the frontier. And so, if we look at the first sentence especially, it says, I have never seen anything like it. 2 little discs of glass suspended in front of eyes in loops of wire. It's almost a kind of surrealist, almost a kind of cubist image that you have to kind of put together in your own mind as a reader. But what certainly comes out of this first sentence, I think, and what develops out of it is this relationship between I and it. I have never seen anything like it. So the novel, as I see it, really revolves around questions of reciprocity. I mean, one of the things the novel revolves around is questions of reciprocity. And by that, I mean, in what ways are you going to see a kind of cultural other, a barbarian, a savage? In what ways do you not see that person? In what ways do you not want to see that person? In what ways do you allow the person or not allow the person to see you? Because if all the cliches come out with seeing, right? Seeing is believing. I see, therefore I know. I'm making this up on the spot. But so as you'll see throughout the novel, and I don't mean to pun on that, that the logic of seeing is fundamental for the ways in which not only physically we see, but also the way that we know. Okay, to see is to believe. I'm thinking of voir, savoir. Voir in the French is to see, savoir is to know. Okay, so all of the intimate relationships between seeing and knowing. And the problem, of course, in this novel is how do we see people who are our enemies or people who are purported to be our enemies? And for the barbarians, you could put in Iraqis at the time that, or Afghans, Mujahideen, or at the time when Coetzee was writing, it was Vietnamese, the way that the Vietnamese were understood and seen by the Americans. And interestingly, I was teaching this novel for the first time around the time of the invasion of Iraq by the Americans, and many Iraqis often talked about the wraparound sunglasses that the American soldiers wore, the kind of reflective things, and they couldn't see their eyes. So there was this need of it was partly because it was in the desert too, but this need of the American soldier to kind of hide his eyes from being seen by the other. I haven't really entirely put my finger on yet what this relationship between seeing and knowing is, but I wanted you to be aware of that as I move into the second. This is part 2 of the Waiting for the Barbarians talk. And in this section, I want to talk about, firstly, the problem of whether this is a kind of South African allegory or an allegory writ large. As I mentioned in the last section, if you're thinking about torture, whether it's torture of Algerians during the War for Independence there, or the torture of Iraqis in Abu Ghraib prison under the American hand, this can be read as a kind of allegorical novel. There's also something kind of Eurasian about the nomadic barbarians that doesn't quite fit into a paradigm that speaks directly to South Africa. But I think there are other ways in which South African readers at the time, in the 70s, would have clearly seen this as an allegory of South African life. And so let me address some of the ways in which this could be read as an allegory of South African history and the South African condition. Firstly, the history of the white presence in South Africa is often oriented around the problem of the frontier and sort of conquering the frontier. For the Afrikaners, who were the relatives of Dutch people who settled in South Africa in the 17th century, their great historical moment, which was sort of celebrated every year, was the Boer Trek. And this was a trek from the Cape, from the Western Cape inland. It would have been like an eastern trek into the interior of the country to escape sort of British rule and develop their own kind of states within the interior of southern Africa. And so where the Americans went west for Manifest Destiny, the Afrikaners went east. So the notions of the frontier are really founded many of the ideologies of South Africa. First, the idea of like rugged individualism. You've just got your gun, you set up your house, you protect yourself against the savages around you, almost the kinds of things that we see in the American Western. There's also this idea of sort of moving away from civilization and being apart from civilization. This whole novel, Waiting for the Barbarians, takes place at the periphery, away from the places of so-called civilization, from the city. And there's also a kind of paranoia that emerges on the frontier, an idea that that anyone is a kind of a suspect. Anyone is kind of potentially a criminal, and part of a racist culture basically makes anyone who's a person of color a suspect within that system. So clearly, there's a South African allegory for this, and not only that, South African men at the time were being sent up to places like Namibia, where there were independence stirrings, and also to the borders of Mozambique, where a lot of the people who were involved with the African National Congress, which was a group resisting apartheid, basically settled and trained militarily in order to kind of overthrow the apartheid government. So the men themselves, white men in South Africa, would have known of the frontier and their responsibility to defend these frontiers, because remember, South Africa was the last country that was liberated in the whole of the continent. So there was this idea that there was all of these black people in these surrounding countries that were going to attack the South Africans, when in fact they had a military that could have destroyed any one of them. So if you turn to page 43, there's a passage that speaks to a little of this, but also kind of, it doesn't speak directly to this, it speaks more to the magistrate's own idea of this kind of purified difference between the cultural self and the cultural other, between the European and the barbarian. And this is on 43, it's the middle paragraph. There have been no barbarian visitors this year. It used to be that groups of nomads would visit the settlement in winter to pitch their tents outside the walls and engage in barter, exchanging wool, skins, felt, and leatherwork for cotton goods, tea, sugar, beans, flour. We prize barbarian leatherwork, especially the sturdy boots they sew. In the past, I've encouraged commerce, but forbidden payment in money. I've also tried to keep the taverns closed to them. Above all, I do not want to see a parasite settlement grow up on the fringes of the town, populated with beggars and vagrants, enslaved to strong drink. It always pained me in the old days to see the people fall victim to the guile of shopkeepers exchanging their goods for trinkets, lying drunk in the gutter, and confirming thereby the settlers' litany of prejudice, that barbarians are lazy, immoral, filthy, stupid. Where civilization entailed the corruption of barbarian virtues and the creation of a dependent people, I decided I was opposed to civilization. And upon this resolution, I based the conduct of my administration. I say this, who now keeps a barbarian girl for my bed. Okay, now this is a very complex paragraph, but in many ways, it suggests, it appears to suggest, on the one hand, that the magistrate actually wants to help the barbarians. In other words, after Colonel Joel has arrived, the barbarian visitors stop coming to the settlement because they know that they're going to be attacked or tortured, etc. But when the barbarians had arrived and had done trade, the magistrate wants to kind of mediate their presence there. He doesn't want to corrupt their culture. He wants them to remain purely barbarian. He doesn't want to make them parasitical. So he avoids paying them in money. He also closes the taverns to them. So these things, money, drink, the things that could spoil an indigenous culture, are things that the magistrate mediates in, that he doesn't want them to be engaged with. So on the one hand, this sounds good, and it sounds like he's protecting a culture from the kind of ways that civilization could spoil this pure ancient culture. But in many ways, interestingly, he's actually reflecting the official apartheid line. And by that, I mean that many proponents of apartheid said that they weren't racist. They just believed that their culture should have their culture and our culture should have our culture, and that we shouldn't mix. And that once we start mixing, we create this kind of hybrid, parasitical culture. And why that was ridiculous was because everybody living with South Africa was already part of the same combined economic system, and the idea that there'd be their culture, our culture, was already ruined by the fact that the cultural economy had already integrated Africans into a system of immigrant labor, etc. So I just wanted to point out, and I know I've gone in a number of directions in this segment, but that the liberal ideology of South Africa, which may appear on the surface to mean good to the cultural other, to the barbarian, in many ways reflects, in truth, the kind of official line of the apartheid, the official line of the apartheid architects. This is the third part of my talk on Waiting for the Barbarians, and I want to address really for many readers, the funnest part of this novel, which is like the long trek out of the empire, at the edge of the empire, to the frontier to meet up with the barbarians, in which he brings the barbarian girl along to kind of recouple with her people. And so I'll read on the top of page 80. We have reached the foothills. The strange horsemen plod on far ahead of us, up the winding bed of the dry stream. We have ceased trying to catch up with them. We understand now that while they are following us, they are also leading us. As the terrain grows rockier, we progress more and more slowly. When we halt to rest or lose sight of the strangers in the windings of the stream, it is without fear of their vanishing. Then, climbing a ridge, coaxing the horses, straining and pushing and hauling, we are all of a sudden upon them. From behind the rocks, from out of a hidden gully, they emerge, men mounted on shaggy ponies. 12 and more, dressed in sheepskin coats and caps, brown-faced, weather-beaten, narrow-eyed, the barbarians in the flesh on native soil. I am close enough to smell them where they stand, horse sweat, smoke, half-cured leather. One of them points at my chest, an ancient musket nearly as long as a man, with a dipod rest bolted near the muzzle. My heart stops. No, I whisper. With elaborate caution, I drop the reins of the horse I am leading and display empty hands. As slowly as I turn my back, take up my reins, and, slipping and sliding on the scree, lead my horse the 30 paces down the foot of the ridge where my companions wait. The barbarians stand outlined against the sky above us. There is the beating of my heart, the heaving of the horses, the moan of the wind, and no other sound. We have crossed the limits of the empire. It is not a moment to take lightly. I help the girl from her horse. Listen carefully, I say. I will take you up the slope, and you can speak to them. Bring your sticks. The ground is loose. There is no other way up. When you have spoken, you can decide what you want to do. If you want to go with them, if they will see you back to your family, go with them. If you decide to come back with us, you can come back with us. Do you understand? I am not forcing you. She nods. She is very nervous. With an arm around her, I help her up the pebbly slope. The barbarians do not stir. I count 3 of the long-barreled muskets. Otherwise, they bear the short bows I am familiar with. As we reach the crest, they back away slightly. Can you see them? I say, panting. She turns her head in that odd, unmotivated way. Not well, she said. Blind. What is the word for blind? She tells me. I address the barbarians. Blind, I say, touching my eyelids. They make no response. The gun resting between the pony's ears still points at me. Its owner's eyes glint merrily. The silence lengthens. Speak to them, I tell her. Tell them why we are here. Tell them your story. Tell them the truth. She looks sideways at me and gives me a little smile. You really want me to tell them the truth? Tell them the truth. What else is there to tell? The smile does not leave her lips. She shakes her head, keeps her silence. Tell them what you like. Only, now that I've brought you back as far as I can, I wish to ask you very clearly to return to the town with me, of your own choice. I grip her arm. Do you understand? That is what I want. Why? The word falls with deathly softness from her lips. She knows that it confounds me, has confounded me from the beginning. The man with the gun advances slowly until he is almost upon us. She shakes her head. No, I do not want to go back to that place. I scramble down the slope. Light a fire, brew tea. We will stop here, I tell the men. From above, the soft cascade of the girl's speech reaches me, broken by the gusting of the wind. She leans on her 2 sticks. The horsemen dismounted and clustering around her. I cannot make out a word. What a waste, I think. She'd have spent those long, empty evenings teaching me her tongue. Too late now. Okay, there's a lot in this passage. First of all, I just want to mention I'm teaching in my film course Westerns right now, and clearly there's a lot of almost Western imagery here. The barbarians that stand outlined against the sky above us is straight out of John Ford's The Searchers, of this scene in which, shot in Monument Valley in the west of the United States, these mounted Indian soldiers, Native American soldiers, are on this sort of bluff above the white guys who have come to kind of engage with them. But in this case, we don't really have a John Wayne. We have a very sort of nebulous leader, one who wants to give the girl back and then at the last minute doesn't want to give her back. One who wants to integrate her back into her real life, just like you would integrate some wild bird who entered your house and introduce it back into the wild. So I think more than anything else, this whole passage, especially the sort of magistrate's place in it, points to his own kind of clumsiness in relation to his own ideas, his own ideology. He wants it both ways. He wants the girl close to her. He wants to study her. He wants to study her language and know her, but at the same time, he doesn't really want to know her. He wants to know her only as a kind of owner of her. And the girl herself is in a precarious situation because obviously she's been damaged by her encounter with the empire. So I'll just stop here for section 3. This is section 4 of the short mini lectures on Waiting for the Barbarians, and I want to kind of move ahead toward, this is section 5, this is page 141, and really address, I think, one of the main points of Coetzee's novel, one of the main themes of Coetzee's novel, and that's how empires collapse. And as I see it, the way that the empire collapses is not because the barbarians invade and they're evil and they destroy. civilization. It's because so-called civilization itself implodes from within. And what you find in the novel as it develops is this kind of acute hysteria, that everyone becomes kind of hysterical about things, and so hysterical that the sort of civil order is lost at the frontier, in the frontier post. And this is, so let me read on page 141 about this sort of growing hysteria. The barbarians come out at night. Before darkness falls, the last goat must be brought in, the gates barred, a watch set in every lookout to call the hours. All night, it is said, the barbarians prowl about bent on murder and rapine. Children in their dreams see the shutters part and fierce barbarian faces leer through. The barbarians are here, the children scream, and cannot be comforted. Clothing disappears from the washing lines, food from larders, however tightly locked. The barbarians have dug a tunnel under the walls, people say. They come and go as they please, take what they like. No one is safe any longer. The farmers still till the fields, but they go out in bands, never singly. They work without heart. The barbarians are only waiting for the crops to be established, they say, before they flood the fields again. Why doesn't the army stop the barbarians, people complain. Life on the frontier has become too hard. They talk of returning to the old country, but then remember that the roads are no longer safe because of the barbarians. Tea and sugar can no longer be bought over the counter as the shopkeepers hoard their stocks. Those who eat well eat behind closed doors, fearful of awaking their neighbors' envy. Now, interestingly, though it's posited here that neighbors hide from other neighbors and have a lack of transparency with one another, and that they hide behind doors when they eat, I think that also speaks to the larger sort of framework of the empire, in which everything is conducted in terms of gossip, in which there's no transparency, there's no democratically established papers that have varying positions. Everything is hearsay. And I think in many ways that reflects the culture of South Africa at the time, that there was no real freedom of the press to sort of engage with the important issues at the time. So again, I think that this is a wonderful moment in sort of showing how empires implode, that they're not destroyed from within, they're destroyed from things outside. And again, I think that this is not entirely a South African issue. You can make look in some ways in terms of the war on terror in America, and the way in which this sort of super hysteria builds up, and you can almost kind of corrode your own freedoms and your own kind of democratic properties from within when you sort of fear the cultural other in these sort of elevated ways. That's the end of section number 4, and I'm going to just quit here and try to put this on YouTube. But I hope you have time to give this a listen. Thank you.